Inspector Purbright,
Where is he going?
the widow's
Somewhere.
key
I don't know.
that shouldn't
Must know
exist.
someone.
BBC Radio Mystery. Morning in Flaxborough began, as it often did, with the soft choreography of the ordinary. Milk bottles stood in their frosted ranks, dogs exchanged mild insults through garden fences, and the postman's bicycle made its apologetic whir along High Street. The town's calm had texture, a faint, habitual hum that belonged to roofs, hedges, and good manners. Mrs. Ethel Cobbold of number 17 Bellway Terrace lived according to that hum. Her breakfast tray was precisely arranged, one boiled egg, a triangle of toast, and the small, wincing pot of marmalade that had lasted her 3 weeks. It was in the act of adjusting the wireless dial to hear the 9 o'clock news, and not a minute before, that she noticed the envelope. It lay apart from the circulars, pale against the wood. Her name was written with deliberate grace, Mrs. E. Cobbold. The handwriting was not strange. It was painfully familiar. So much so that her breath caught with a small, almost indignant sound. The key inside was brass, heavy for its size, and bore the initials H.C., her husband's initials, Harold Cobbold. Dead these 15 years and buried with his pocket watch, his spectacles and, she had insisted, the small desk key from his office days. She sat back slowly, eyes travelling the room as though searching for a witness. The kettle rattled on the stove, unseen. From across the hedge, Mrs. Plum, her neighbour of 20 years and unlicensed guardian of local conscience, saw Ethel's hands tremble. By lunchtime, she would tell at least 4 people that something had quite undone poor Mrs. Cobbold. A letter from the other side, by the look of her. At the police station, meanwhile, Inspector Purbright stood by the notice board, reading the week's reports with an expression that might have passed for mild disappointment in humanity. A missing bicycle, a petty theft from a church bazaar, and now, as love informed him with his characteristic blend of sympathy and relish, a widow who's received a ghost's post. Purbright's eyebrows made their brief, civil assent. "Ah," he said, as if it were an ordinary meteorological event. "A supernatural delivery. And does the ghost sign his correspondence?" Love smiled. "Not exactly, sir, but there's a key involved." "And, well, it's apparently his." Purbright turned toward the window. The morning fog was thinning into polite daylight. "Then perhaps," he said, "we'd better see which of the dead is so determined to keep in touch." He reached for his coat, not from urgency, but from the steady curiosity that made his presence in Flaxborough both reassuring and faintly unsettling, for it was known, or at least suspected, that Inspector Purbright regarded human behaviour much as an antiquarian regards coins, tokens of value, always worth examination, never truly surprising. As he and Love stepped into the cobbled street, the town's rhythm continued as before. Yet, somewhere in that calm, a hinge had turned. A key had found its way back to a hand that should never have held it again, and Flaxborough, without realizing it, had already begun to remember. The news of Mrs. Cobbold's mysterious post travelled with remarkable efficiency, borne not by telephone or telegram, but by the delicate machinery of small-town conversation. Before the noon bells had faded, 3 versions of the story were already in circulation. One supernatural, one scandalous, and one distinctly administrative. By mid-afternoon, the tale had been poured, stirred, and served across every parlour worth its lace doilies. Mrs. Plum, armed with a moral compass and the speed of rumour, led the first wave. "Not a word of a lie," she declared, to Miss Copping at the haberdashery counter. "The poor soul received a key, his key, sent from heaven knows where. If you ask me, there's mischief about. Perhaps something left behind that was meant to stay hidden." Miss Copping, whose view of the world was governed by the strict economics of thread and trust, nodded gravely. "Or a message. From beyond." By the time Mrs. Plum reached the greengrocer, the tale had acquired colour. "It was a gold key," she said, lowering her voice. "With her husband's initials on it, returned, if you can credit it, from the dead. Mark my words, there's no rest in that household tonight." Across the market square, an errand boy hurried past, eager not to overhear. In Flaxborough, the fastest way to become part of a story was to linger near one. At the police station, the air was thick with paper and patience. Sergeant Love was updating the incident log in his careful, looping hand when Purbright entered, brushing a faint trace of drizzle from his hat. "Good morning, sir," Love said, though it was already 2:30. "It's turning into quite the day for correspondence. We've had 2 complaints about unsigned notes. One accusing Mrs. Fawcett of poisoning a cat, the other reminding Mr. Clegg to pay his bridge debts." Purbright paused by the window, where light slanted through in modest stripes. "We do seem to attract an industrious class of letter-writers. And what of the widow's key? Has she recovered her composure?" Love looked up from his ledger, a faint gleam of curiosity escaping his professionalism. "Recovered, sir? Yes, but not reassured. I called by briefly, on your suggestion." She was polite, even grateful, though she had that look about her. The one people get when they've seen their past step through the door again. Purbright's mouth curved slightly. Nostalgia can be a distressing visitor. She swore it was her husband's handwriting, sir. The envelope and all. Dated this week, but he's been in the churchyard since before I joined the force. Purbright crossed to his desk and lowered himself into the chair. It creaked softly, as though accustomed to his weight of thought. "And the postmark?" "London," said Love. "No return address. Just the name. Neat as you like." Purbright leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Then either we have a haunting conducted through the Royal Mail, or someone in London has a commendable talent for imitation." Love allowed himself a short laugh. "I'll take forgery over phantoms if it's all the same to you." The inspector smiled faintly, his gaze drifting to the rain beginning to fret against the panes. "The 2 aren't mutually exclusive, Love. In Flaxborough, a haunting is simply a memory with handwriting." A soft knock interrupted them. Constable Harrow entered, cap in hand, bearing a cup of tea so full it threatened rebellion. "Mrs. Plum's been on the telephone again, sir," he said. "Wants to know if she should report a spiritual disturbance in the next street. I took the liberty of suggesting she make a note of it and await further manifestations." "Excellent initiative," Purbright murmured. "Perhaps she might form a committee." When Harrow departed, Love shook his head with fond exasperation. "I'll never understand it, sir. How a single key can set half the county talking." "Because," said Purbright, "it's not about the key, it's about permission, to imagine something beyond their own tidy afternoons. People rarely believe in ghosts, Love. They simply need them." He rose and moved to the filing cabinet, pulling out a slim folder marked "Cobbled, H. Deceased," an old insurance investigation from a decade ago, yellowed but still fragrant with dust and ink. Inside were routine documents, policy forms, an accident report, a widow's claim. Nothing sinister. Yet, as he turned the pages, a small photograph slipped free, a company portrait, faded to sepia. He studied it briefly. Rows of clerks and typists posed outside an office door. A younger Mrs. Cobbled sat demurely in front, her expression measured and remote. Behind her stood Harold Cobbled himself, one hand resting lightly on the back of her chair. Purbright's gaze lingered on the faces around them. 2 men, 1 woman, all now ghosts in a less romantic sense. He replaced the photograph carefully, his mind measuring distances not of space but of motive. Love watched him with respectful curiosity. "You think it's connected, sir? Something from back then?" "I think," Purbright said, closing the folder, "that time has a curious way of tidying up after human error, until someone moves the furniture again." He crossed back to the window, where the rain had turned the square into a faint reflection of itself. The voices from outside came muted through the glass, the exchange of greetings, the clink of a bicycle chain, the faint gossip carried on damp air. "Tomorrow," he said quietly. "We'll pay Mrs. Cobbold another visit. Bring the envelope if she'll allow it."
"And the key?"
"I should like to see what sort of lock it prefers," Love nodded, scribbling a note. "You think there'll be one to match it?" Purbright's tone was almost thoughtful amusement. "There always is, Sergeant. Whether we find the lock or the truth first, that's the only uncertainty." The church clock struck 3, each chime folding itself into the rain. Purbright stood a moment longer, listening to the sound fade into the town's slow rhythm. Outside, the mist had begun to creep down from the hills again, sealing Flaxborough in its pale cocoon. In the rooms where curtains were drawn and kettles refilled, voices kept whispering of letters that travelled from graves, of keys that fitted nothing or everything, and as dusk thickened over the square, the inspector turned down his lamp and began, in his steady hand, a brief note for the file. "An object without origin has entered the town. Observe reactions before causes." He capped his pen, and in the silence that followed, the rain continued its discreet applause upon the glass, as if Flaxborough itself were waiting to see what the key would next unlock. By morning the rain had softened into a low mist, the kind that makes the streets of Flaxborough seem half-remembered, edges blurred, sounds dulled, colours dampened into civility. Inspector Purbright, walking up Bellway Terrace, appeared as one of its more deliberate shapes, steady, unhurried, and politely intrusive. Number 17 was as it had always been, a cottage of spotless order and quiet pride. The curtains hung as if supervised, the brass letter slot gleamed without need of occasion, and the front garden, though reduced by age to a few potted geraniums, displayed a stubborn neatness. Mrs. Ethel Cobbold received him at the door, wearing a cardigan the colour of weak tea and an expression that hovered between dignity and distress. She greeted him as though politeness were a form of armour. "Inspector?"
"How kind. I was just about to take my tea."
"Will you come in?" Purbright inclined his head. "Only for a few minutes, Mrs. Cobbold. I thought it best to inquire how you fared after yesterday's surprise." Inside, the air held a faint perfume of lavender polish and sealed windows. It was a room curated against time, family photographs precisely aligned, lace antimacassars folded to regulation, a mantelpiece clock ticking with schoolmasterly precision. Mrs. Cobbold gestured to a chair, then, after a small hesitation, sat opposite, her posture suggesting an interview rather than a visit. On the small table between them lay the brass key, gleaming faintly in the lamplight. "You've brought it close to hand," Purbright observed, his tone light, her lips pressed into the suggestion of a smile.
"I didn't like to leave it out of sight. It's
silly, perhaps, but after so many years, well, one doesn't expect to be addressed by the dead." "Few do," said Purbright. He leaned forward, his hands loosely folded. "Might I see the envelope again?" She opened a drawer in the sideboard with deliberate care and produced it, wrapped in a clean handkerchief. The act had the air of ceremony, as though the object were a relic. Purbright examined it under the mild light from the window. The handwriting was elegant, slanted slightly to the right, its letters formed with an effort that suggested both discipline and age. The postmark, faint but legible, read London, SW1. "Your husband's hand, you're certain?" "Quite. There's the little loop he always made on his D, and the flourish of the E in Ethel." No one else could have written it so. Purbright gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You recall anyone who might have kept samples of his writing? Former colleagues, perhaps?" She shook her head.
"None that I know of."
"The firm closed years ago."
"I've had no contact with anyone from those days." A pause settled. Polite, uneasy.
The clock marked it with 2 delicate ticks. "I remember the day we buried him," she said suddenly. He looked so composed, as if he'd merely finished a sentence and laid down his pen. They gave me his effects, his watch, a wallet, the little key from his desk.
I placed it in the casket myself.
I remember the sound it made, a tiny clink, like a period at the end of a long life. Her voice trembled on that last phrase, then steadied.
And now it's here again. Purbright looked at her, his expression a study in gentleness. Objects have their own journeys, Mrs. Cobbold. They change hands, change stories.
Sometimes they come back only to remind us they existed. She gave him a sharp glance. You think someone sent it to mock me, I think, he replied evenly. Someone sent it to see what would happen. Her gaze fell to the key once more.
Then they've succeeded. He allowed a respectful silence.
The sound of a car passing outside brushed faintly against the window pane. The kettle in the adjoining room sighed into its boil. Would you permit me to borrow these, the key and the envelope, for a short while? Purbright asked. She hesitated, her fingers tightening on her skirt. I'd rather you didn't. I can't explain it, Inspector, but I feel it should stay here.
It seemed connected. Purbright inclined his head.
Of course. Then perhaps you'd allow me to note a few details before I go. He drew a small notebook from his pocket and, in his precise script, recorded the key's dimensions, the engraving, the postal mark. As he wrote, his gaze moved quietly around the room. The photographs, the bookshelf, the framed certificate of the Flaxborough Women's Union. 1958, behind all that order, lay the faint vibration of unease. He could almost hear it, like a clock running too fast. Tell me, he said, not looking up. Did your husband often write letters in his later years? Not often, she replied. He kept to his desk, of course. A great deal of paperwork for the firm. But personal letters? No.
Not after.
Not after the trouble. The trouble? She blinked, as though startled by her own candour. Oh, nothing serious.
A misunderstanding.
An error in one of the company accounts. It caused some embarrassment. Purbright made a neutral sound.
I see. And the desk, you still have it?
No, she said. I sold it soon after. To a dealer in Bingham. I thought it best to part with such reminders. Purbright closed his notebook, tucking the pencil neatly behind his ear. Objects again, he said softly. They never seemed to agree with being parted from their stories. Mrs. Cobbold gave a short, uncertain laugh. You make it sound almost superstitious. Not at all, said Purbright. Just human? He rose, setting his hat on his head with careful respect. Thank you, Mrs. Cobbold. You've been most helpful. If there's any further post in anything curious or similar, would you let me know at once?
Of course, Inspector. He paused at the doorway.
And perhaps, for your own peace of mind, avoid showing the key about too freely. In a town such as ours, curiosity tends to multiply faster than truth. Her eyes softened. I'll remember that. As he stepped outside, the mist pressed lightly against his coat, cool and faintly scented with coal smoke. The quiet along Bellway Terrace had the sound of withheld conversation. Curtains shifting. A latch clicking closed. Purbright walked on, unhurried, the thought forming gently in his mind that somewhere in the tidy lanes of Flaxborough, someone else was also waiting, watching, perhaps, for the widow's reaction to the key that should not exist. And as the church clock marked the hour behind him, its echo folded neatly into the fog, leaving only the measured rhythm of his footsteps, the sound of curiosity politely disguised as concern. By the next afternoon, Flaxborough had solved the mystery to its collective satisfaction. It did so with the ease of a cat curling into the shape of its own contentment. The key, it was agreed, had clearly been misplaced years ago and recently rediscovered by some well-meaning antique dealer. Or, depending on whom one asked, by a clerk of the more forgetful variety. The story spread in that comforting tone reserved for illnesses that turn out to be mild. The widow Cobbled's fright became a gentle anecdote, its edges filed smooth by repetition. Even Mrs. Plum, now claiming intimate knowledge of the matter, told it as proof that Providence tidies what we mislay if we give it long enough. Purbright heard these theories accumulate like silt through the morning, delivered piecemeal by Love, who had an ear finely attuned to the public imagination. They've decided it's all perfectly natural. "Sir," he said, standing by the window with a small smile, "a dealer down Bingham Way sold a batch of office furniture. Someone in London might have bought the desk, found the key and posted it back out of courtesy. Case closed." Purbright looked up from his paperwork. "Closed by whom, I wonder? The Almighty or Mrs. Plum?" "Bit of both, perhaps," said Love cheerfully. The inspector regarded his notes, eyes half-focused. "There's an admirable instinct for order in this town. When something cannot be explained, it is promptly tidied into something that can. Better than panic, I suppose? Not necessarily. Panic at least implies curiosity." A pause, soft but deliberate. The only sound was the shuffle of files and the steady creak of the radiator behind them. Purbright's gaze drifted to the window. Beyond the glass, the square was caught in a slow drizzle, each droplet finding its place upon the cobbles. "I'd like a trace run on that envelope," he said at last. "The postmark was London, SW1. Let's see what recent outgoing mail of that type's been logged." "Registered special or otherwise irregular?" Love raised an eyebrow. "You think it was posted by someone local visiting London?" "I think," Purbright replied, "that coincidence is the laziest conspirator of all, and I dislike being asked to believe in it." Love nodded, scribbling in his notebook. "Shall I send the request through headquarters?" "If you would, quietly." When the door closed behind him, Purbright leaned back in his chair, the springs complaining faintly. His thoughts moved with their usual measured economy. It wasn't the key itself that troubled him. Objects had a way of drifting between owners, like thoughts misplaced in the attic of time. No, it was the handwriting. The writing bore the subtle hesitation of age, a tremor, not of the hand, but of memory. Someone who remembered how Harold Cobbold used to write. That was what disturbed him, the precision of recollection. He opened his notebook again, studying his own scrawled observations. Mrs. Cobbald's composure yesterday had struck him as the most polished thing in her parlour. The relief she had shown, so quickly, so gracefully, had the smoothness of rehearsal. A clock chimed somewhere down the corridor. The sound echoed briefly, soft and metallic. He rose and crossed to the map on the wall, tracing with one finger the neat arterial lines between Flaxborough and the capital.
London, the perfect place for anonymity.
Too distant to question, too large to trace, yet never so far as to feel foreign. A convenient ghost. Later that afternoon, he took his usual walk through the high street, his presence enough to prompt polite self-censorship in the conversations he passed. Still, fragments reached him. Laughter, conjecture, the word desk, repeated with amused certainty. When he reached the tea shop, he saw Mrs. Cobbold seated by the window with her neighbour. Her posture was improved, her colour restored. She was smiling. Though even through the glass, Purbright detected the stiffness of performance. She noticed him, inclined her head with the brief nod of social duty. He returned it, barely perceptible, and moved on. The town, it seemed, had already decided to be comforted. The mysterious key was now an anecdote, destined for retelling at church bazaars and sewing circles. The living, Purbright thought, are most efficient at burying the strange. They do it with conversation. He stopped at the tobacconist's and purchased a small packet of matches, more from habit than need. The shop bell chimed, a fragile, optimistic sound. And outside, the rain had ceased. The sky hung low, colourless, attentive. As he lit his pipe beneath the canopy, Love approached from the direction of the post office, his cap pushed slightly askew. "Message back from headquarters, sir. They'll have to check with the London sorting office, but nothing unusual reported yet."
No missing packets, no traced handwriting requests. Purbright exhaled a thin thread of smoke.
"Good, let's not disturb their efficiency. Shall I continue pressing?" "No, let's allow the matter to cool. Sometimes truth comes out when people believe it's been forgotten." They began to walk together along the pavement, their reflections keeping pace in the wet glass of the shop fronts, Love said after a while. You don't think it was the dealer, then? Purbright's eyes followed a sparrow darting across the square, its wings clipping the stillness. A dealer wouldn't post something without identifying himself. Honesty is the only advertisement such men can afford. Then who? Purbright tapped the ash from his pipe, his tone faintly distant. Someone with a reason to appear harmless. Someone for whom explanation is protection. A church bell tolled the half hour. The sound travelled across the rooftops like a careful echo. Purbright watched the thin curl of steam from the tea shop window fade into the greying air. Keep your ear to the ground, Love, he said quietly. Listen for anyone who's begun remembering things too clearly. Too clearly, sir? Yes, Purbright murmured, his gaze lingering on the narrow street beyond. Past rarely volunteers its presence without purpose. When it does, it's usually because someone's about to profit from the reminder. They parted at the corner. Love turned toward the station, while Purbright continued his slow walk along the terrace. Lamps flickered on one by one, their light diffused in the mist. The town resumed its rhythm, footsteps, closing doors, the soft percussion of daily safety. Yet behind those windows, somewhere between comfort and guilt, the story of the key had begun to breathe again. Purbright stopped beneath a lamppost, listening to the faint hiss of gas, and smiled to himself. The kind of smile that knew when calm had been arranged too neatly. Then, with his hands folded behind his back, he disappeared once more into the fog, leaving only the sound of the evening settling around him, an ordinary quiet concealing something that refused quite to rest. It was the smallest of discoveries, and yet Purbright felt it settle in the mind like a grain of grit under glass. The record came by way of a polite letter from the Bingham auctioneers, its paper faintly perfumed with dust and competence. The late Miss Veronica Clee, it stated, had purchased one oak writing desk, Edwardian, modestly carved, formerly of Cobbold and Trimble Insurance Associates. Purbright turned the paper over in his hands, as though half expecting the answer to appear on the reverse.
Clee, he murmured. That name rings a bell, Love. She worked under Cobbold, didn't she?
Love was already consulting the old personnel index, a relic kept in an office drawer that smelled faintly of linseed and thyme. Yes, sir. Typist, mid-50s to early 60s.
Lived alone. Never married.
Died last year. Heart trouble, apparently. The coroner wrote it up as uneventful. Most deaths are, Purbright said softly. It's the living that insist on embellishment. He rose, taking his hat from the stand. Come along, Love. We'll visit Bingham. There's an auctioneer there whose memory for faces may outlast his stock. The road to Bingham wound through flat, wet fields where mist rose from the hedgerows in languid folds. Love drove, humming quietly, while Purbright watched the landscape pass like a series of pale watercolours. He had long observed that England's gentlest scenery often concealed the sharpest histories. The auction house stood on the edge of the market square, a converted chapel whose pulpit had been replaced by a desk and ledger. Inside, the air carried the sweet, stale scent of polish and paper labels. The proprietor, Mr. Goff, met them with a professional cheerfulness that thinned perceptibly when Purbright introduced himself. Inspector Purbright, Flaxborough Police. We're inquiring about a desk sold from the late Miss Veronica Clee's estate. Edwardian oak by your records. Goff nodded, adjusting his spectacles with a nervous thumb.
Ah, yes, I remember the lot.
A plain piece, though solid. It went at the winter sale 3 months ago. Bit of local interest, that one. Local interest? Purbright's tone remained mild, though it had a faint edge of curiosity. Yes, sir. A gentleman came in beforehand, said he represented the Cobbold estate, wanted to view some personal papers Miss Clee had apparently kept in the desk, very insistent that they were of sentimental value only. We allowed him to examine the contents. He took away a small bundle of letters and paid a deposit for the desk itself. And his name?
Gave it as Merrick. Harold Merrick. Love looked up from his notebook.
We've no one by that name in Flaxborough, sir. Goff shrugged apologetically. Nor had I, Sergeant. Still, he was respectable enough.
Mid-50s tidy suit, London accent.
Said he'd been a colleague of Mr. Cobble's years ago.
Polite, though rather, deliberate, if you take my meaning. Purbright gave a slight smile.
Deliberate is an excellent quality in a thief, Mr. Goff. Did he collect the desk himself? Indeed he did.
Hired a van.
Signed for it and left the same day. And this was 3 months ago? Near enough. Purbright's eyes lingered on the rows of furniture behind the man. Forgotten chairs, clocks, sideboards with half their history missing. Do you recall anything else about him? Goff hesitated. Only that he asked, twice mind, whether anyone else had shown interest in the piece. When I said no, he seemed pleased.
Relieved even, the inspector inclined his head.
Thank you, Mr. Goff. That's very helpful. Outside, the afternoon had thinned to a flat, grey light. Rain drifted across the square like falling ash. Love broke the silence first. Merrick, sir. Do you think he was after the letters or the desk? After something he feared might still be inside the desk, said Purbright. Whether he found it or not is the question. They walked toward the car, their footsteps soft on the wet stones. The town's clock struck the hour, its echo folding neatly between the buildings. On the drive back, Love said, "You don't suppose Miss Clee was involved in the old trouble Mrs. Cobble mentioned?" Purbright's expression did not change, though his gaze remained fixed on the misted road ahead. It would be tidy, wouldn't it? The loyal typist and her employer's indiscretion. Death, remorse, perhaps even blackmail. All the ingredients of a tale fit for gossip. But tidy stories, as we've seen, are Flaxborough's favourite illusion, Love smiled faintly. Still, it'd be convenient if true. Convenience, Purbright replied, is what we call coincidence when we've grown tired of looking. Back in Flaxborough, the day was already dimming to the dull orange of evening gaslight. Purbright returned to his office, coat still damp, and stood by the radiator while Love filed the notes. The sound of dripping eaves outside marked the passage of time like a slow metronome. "Find out what you can about this Merrick," Purbright said quietly. "Check company records from the old Cobbled firm. If his name appears anywhere, I'll be astonished, which is reason enough to look. Yes, sir. And one more thing. Ask the post office whether they've processed any parcels or letters to Mrs. Cobbled from London in recent weeks."
Unusual handwriting.
Might have been declared as personal. Love nodded and departed, the door closing softly behind him. Purbright stood for a moment in the hush that followed. On his desk lay the copy of the auction ledger, its ink still faintly smudged from Goff's thumb. He studied the line, Lot 143, Desk Oak Edwardian. Buyer, Merrick, Cobbled Estate. Something in the phrasing struck him. The Cobbled Estate. There was no such thing. Harold Cobbled had died intestate, and his wife had settled his affairs years ago. Whoever Merrick was, he had claimed a ghostly authority, a title that did not exist, but sounded impeccably plausible. Purbright sat down, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The image of Mrs. Cobbled returned to him, her composure, her careful speech, the way her hand had hovered protectively near the key. A woman determined to preserve her history exactly as it had been written, even when the ink began to fade. Outside, a foghorn moaned faintly from the river, though Flaxborough lay miles inland. The sound was merely the wind through the drains, yet it gave the impression of something distant, calling across years. Purbright smiled without humour. "Merrick," he said softly to the empty room. "If that was your name, you've chosen it well. You sound like a man who keeps company with ghosts." The clock struck 6. He closed the ledger, switched off the lamp, and let the darkness reclaim the office, its silence measured, patient, and full of unanswered correspondence. The following morning arrived without the courtesy of sunlight. Flaxborough lay under a low pewter sky, its chimneys exhaling slow ribbons of smoke that seemed reluctant to rise. Inside the police station, the day began in its usual key of understatement. A shuffle of papers, the clink of teaspoons, the quiet authority of routine. Sergeant Love entered with a sheaf of documents and a faintly triumphant look. "Post office," returned the query, "sir. There's record of a letter to Mrs. Cobbold from London, posted from the Waterloo district about 10 days before she received it. No name, but the clerk recalls it being paid in cash. Thin envelope, light private hand. The sort people use for personal mischief." Purbright accepted the file, scanning the page. "Good. That narrows our ghost to the South Bank." "And Merrick?" Love hesitated. "No one by that name in any of the Cobbold firm's ledgers."
"Nor in the London Register of Insurance Clerks."
"If he worked there, he's managed to erase himself entirely." "Then we must assume he's either fictional or excessively tidy." Purbright rose, slipping the file under his arm. "Let's pay another call on Mrs. Cobbold. I'm curious to see how relief matures overnight." Bellway Terrace, at mid-morning, was already awake to the ceremony of domestic order. Doors open for deliveries, brooms sweeping damp steps, neighbours conducting their social patrol from window to window. When Purbright and Love reached number 17, the curtains were half drawn, a small but telling withdrawal. Mrs. Cobbold received them in the parlour once more. Her composure had grown brittle, as though sustained by effort alone. On the table beside her sat the same key, its brass dulled slightly since their last visit. "I thought you might wish to be informed," Purbright began with gentle courtesy, "that your mysterious correspondent seems to have posted from London, the Waterloo district." Her eyes flickered briefly. "London, I see. And the explanation holds, doesn't it? Someone found the key, a kind person, I'm sure." "Possibly," Purbright said, "though the handwriting remains an unusual coincidence." "I told you, Inspector. It is my husband's." "Yes. And yet it was written with a hand that knows him rather than is him. There's a difference." Her lips tightened, and for a moment the silence in the room was so still it seemed to have edges. Love glanced down at his notebook as though to ease the pressure of watching. Purbright's gaze moved to the small photograph on the mantelpiece, a younger Harold Cobbold beside his wife, their expressions professional rather than affectionate. "Oh, you mentioned once," he said, "a misunderstanding at your husband's firm. A matter of the accounts. I'd rather not discuss that." "I understand," he said mildly.
"Only it may relate to this business with the desk."
"Miss Veronica Clee, your husband's typist, acquired it when the firm closed." Mrs. Cobbald's head lifted, startled, despite herself. "Miss Clee?"
She had the desk?"
"For nearly 20 years, Purbright said, until her death last year." Something changed in her face then, a quiet disintegration, small but unmistakable. "She should never have kept that desk," she said, more to herself than to them.
"It wasn't hers." "Few things are, Mrs. Cobbold," said Purbright softly.
"We only pretend they are to keep life manageable." She looked at him sharply, then turned her gaze to the key.
"If Miss Clee had it, perhaps she sent this." "She's been dead 12 months. Her hand rose to her throat. "Then someone else."
"Indeed," said Purbright. "Someone who knew what the desk once held." When they left, Love said quietly, "That shook her, sir." Purbright nodded, tucking his gloves into his coat pocket. Guilt recognizes its own reflection, even when it wears another face. By afternoon, Love had traced the auction records to a solicitor's office in Lincoln, where Miss Clee's will had been processed. Among her personal effects, correspondence, clippings, a set of letters bound with ribbon, were several references to the old office days, marked confidential. Purbright arranged for them to be reviewed. The solicitor, a thin man with the complexion of faded parchment, welcomed them with professional reluctance. "We do have certain items, Inspector. They concern no legal matters now the estate is closed, but we've kept them for the sake of discretion. You understand? It's not every day we find clients who preserve such personal material." He unlocked a drawer and produced a small bundle wrapped in waxed paper. The ribbon had long since lost its colour. Inside were a dozen letters written on firm stationery. Cobbled and Trimble Insurance, 1959. Purbright unfolded the first, reading aloud just enough to confirm its tone. "My dearest V, you must understand the necessity of silence. Appearances are cruel, but the truth would be crueler still." He stopped there, the faintest exhale marking the line between discovery and comprehension. Love said softly, "That's his handwriting." "Yes," Purbright replied, "and her preservation of it tells us she valued proof above sentiment." They worked through the letters in silence. Each one, tender but fearful, charted an affair contained by guilt and office etiquette. The last was unsigned but unmistakably hers. Brief, almost businesslike. "Do not call again. The matter is concluded." Love cleared his throat. "That would have been the year before his death, sir." Purbright replaced the papers carefully. "Perhaps the year he realized that honor and convenience rarely fit the same keyhole." They thanked the solicitor and stepped back into the chill of the late afternoon. The street smelled faintly of coal smoke and wet stone. Love said, after a pause, "So, Miss Clee kept his letters all those years. Maybe she meant to return them one day. Or maybe someone found them after she died."
"Merrick, perhaps?" "Perhaps," Purbright murmured.
Though Merrick's interest may not have been romantic, letters are currency, love, especially when the dead can't contradict their contents. He walked a few paces before adding, almost to himself, "Flaxborough doesn't so much hide its scandals as pickle them. They grow sharper with time." Love smiled ruefully. "That's true enough, sir. Flaxborough doesn't keep secrets. It just lets them ripen." Purbright stopped, turning to regard him with approval. "An elegant observation, Sergeant. And like most truths, unpleasantly applicable." They crossed the market square where the lamplighter was already at his evening rounds. In the growing dimness the shops closed one by one, shutters drawn like eyelids. The town, unaware of its own exposure, settled once more into its familiar masquerade. In the inspector's office later, as darkness pressed against the windows, Purbright laid the letters on his desk, arranging them in careful sequence. The paper was brittle, the ink still dark enough to betray passion once thought extinguished. He tapped the last letter thoughtfully.
"A matter concluded," he said softly.
But only for her. For someone else, it seems, the conclusion was never accepted. The radiator hissed faintly, echoing the sound of rain on the sill. Purbright stared at the key lying beside the files. Small, ordinary, inert. Yet everything now circled back to it, as if the brass itself had absorbed the echoes of voices long stilled. Outside, the church clock struck 7, a deliberate, resonant sound that seemed to count not just the hour, but the weight of things resurfacing. And, in the quiet that followed, Purbright closed his notebook, extinguished the lamp, and sat a moment longer in the half-dark, listening to the town breathe beneath its rain. A town content in its silence, unaware that its past had just begun once again to speak. It arrived 2 mornings later, dropped through the letterbox at number 17 with the unassuming clatter of ordinary post. Mrs. Cobbold was in the kitchen, measuring tea leaves with her usual precision when she heard it. The sound made her hand tremble, scattering a few dark flecks upon the saucer. She stood motionless for a moment, listening. No voices outside, no retreating footsteps, only the faint hum of milk carts down the terrace. Still, something in the quality of that fall told her the letter was not common. The envelope was pale cream, unmarked, folded once as though handled with care. No stamp, no address. Only her name, written in the same neat, deliberate script that had haunted her every thought for the past week. She did not call for help, She did not even sit down. Instead, with a steadiness born of habit, she took a silver letter knife from the mantel drawer and slit it open. Inside was a single page, torn cleanly from a diary. The paper was faintly yellowed, the ink browned with age, but the words, written in a familiar, measured hand, were unmistakable. I took what was not mine, not in coin or deed, but in words and honour. The guilt has never left me. I pray forgiveness may find me before she does. There was no signature, no date.
Only that last line, underlined twice, before she does. The page slipped from her fingers.
A low, fragile sound escaped her, half gasp, half sigh. Then the world narrowed into a swirl of grey, and the teacup she had held struck the floor with the soft chime of something final. It was Mrs. Plum who found her an hour later, pale and motionless upon the rug, the letter beside her. Within 10 minutes the local doctor had been fetched. Within 20, word had reached the police station. By the time Purbright arrived, Mrs. Cobbold had regained consciousness and was sitting up in bed, colour returning to her cheeks by degrees. The air in the room smelled faintly of ammonia and lavender salts. She looked up as he entered, eyes wide with a kind of frightened composure.
I didn't think there could be another, Inspector.
Not after the key. Purbright set his hat upon the bedside table. May I see it? Mrs. Plum, hovering with the air of someone torn between duty and curiosity, handed him the folded sheet. He thanked her with the quiet firmness that sent her, reluctantly, to the kitchen. Purbright held the page between finger and thumb, careful not to disturb the brittle edges. The handwriting was familiar, too much so. The same tidy slope, the same hesitant curls. Yet this time there was no attempt to disguise age. He turned it toward the window, letting the grey morning light wash across it. The ink shimmered faintly, not from freshness, but from oils drawn to the surface by time. Old, he murmured.
Decades at least.
But folded recently. Mrs. Cobble's voice trembled. What does it mean? Why send me this now?
That, Purbright said, is what we must find out.
May I take it with me for examination? She nodded, then clutched at his sleeve.
Inspector, do you believe it's his confession?
He looked at her kindly. I believe it's written to make you think so. The words seemed to steady her, though they offered no comfort. Downstairs, Love waited in the parlour, hat in hand. She's all right, sir? Recovering, said Purbright. The shock was deliberate. This wasn't sent to haunt her. It was meant to break her, Love frowned.
A forgery, then?
Perhaps, but an accomplished one. The paper's genuine. The ink, iron gall, the sort used before the 60s. Someone's gone to trouble finding it. Then it was planned. Every move since the key has been, Purbright said quietly. The first letter was to stir curiosity. This one's to deepen guilt.
It's a pattern, bait and line.
The question is who's holding the rod. He turned the folded sheet once more, studying the creases. The edges were faintly oily, as though handled by someone whose fingers had absorbed the scent of machinery or varnish. He slipped it into an envelope and buttoned his coat. We'll take it back to the station.
And have a word with that auctioneer again.
I want to know who handled Miss Clee's letters before Merrick arrived. Love followed him out into the pale afternoon. The town lay muffled in mist, roofs softened into shadow. As they crossed the square, the faint clang of the church bell carried through the damp air, each strike sounding more like a warning than a measure of time. By evening, the tests confirmed Purbright's suspicions. The ink, though old, had oxidized recently. Exposure to air within the last few days. Whoever had folded it had awakened it, as if disturbing a long sleep. He stood at his desk, the lamp throwing a pool of amber light across the page. A theft of words and honour, he read aloud. Curious phrasing, a sort of guilt that belongs to betrayal, not of money, but of trust. Love leaned on the filing cabinet. Could the letters we found have been copied, sir?
Maybe Merrick, whoever he was, that took more than we know. Possible, Purbright said.
But there's another possibility. Miss Clee may have kept a diary of her own. Those letters, after all, were only half the conversation. He moved to the window where the fog pressed like damp linen against the glass. Somewhere beyond it, Flaxborough's streets wound their quiet course, indifferent to the dramas they harboured. "She wrote that the matter was concluded," he said softly. "Yet it seems someone has decided otherwise." The clock on the wall ticked with patient insistence. Love broke the silence.
"You think the key was just to get her attention, sir?"
"The key," Purbright replied, turning back to him, "was the overture."
"This," he tapped the page lightly, "is the melody."
"The sender wants Mrs. Cobble to hear a tune she can't forget. And what happens when she remembers the words?" Purbright gave a small, tired smile. "Then, Sergeant, the performance will have served its purpose." He folded the page into a file marked "Cobbled Inquiry" and extinguished the lamp. The room dimmed to the faint blue of evening. Outside the fog thickened, swallowing the last light. As they stepped out into it, the world had that hushed, listening quality, as if the town itself were leaning closer to hear what came next. Love buttoned his coat against the chill. "Funny thing, sir. All this time we've been chasing what the key might open." Purbright glanced toward the faint glow of Bellway Terrace in the distance. "Perhaps we've been mistaken, love. Perhaps it doesn't open anything at all. Perhaps it locks something in." And as they walked away, the fog closed behind them, seamless, secretive, and very nearly kind. The following morning unfolded beneath a pale, lidless sky, the kind that pressed upon Flaxborough like an unfinished thought. The mist had lifted, but left behind its smell, damp stone and soot, and the town, relieved of mystery for the moment, returned to its business with an air of borrowed calm. Inspector Purbright, however, was not deceived by the illusion of order. At his desk, a pot of cooling tea beside him, he studied the letters and the diary page under a magnifying lens. The morning light slid slowly across the paper, tracing its creases, catching the ink's tired gleam. He had arranged the handwriting samples in 2 rows. The letters from Harold Cobbled to Miss Clee above, the more recent envelope and confession below. To the untrained eye, they might have been written by the same hand. Yet to Purbright, whose patience was forensic in its sympathy, the differences began to whisper. The early letters bore the confidence of a man used to his pen, firm descenders, confident loops, a writer conscious of his authority. But the newer lines, those on the envelope and more particularly on the diary page, carried a hesitant imitation. The signature that wasn't there was almost visible, hovering in restraint. Purbright leaned back, the wooden chair giving a soft complaint. "Remorse," he murmured, "is a curious traveller. Some send it by post, others by proxy." Love, entering with 2 cups of tea and a handful of notes, caught the tail of that reflection. "Remorse, sir?" Purbright smiled faintly. "An emotion that keeps better than one would expect. It doesn't fade, merely changes address." He gestured to the documents. The handwriting. "I think we've been addressing the wrong ghost." Love set down the tea, his eyes narrowing in interest. "You found something? Enough to spoil a neat theory?" Purbright took up the lens again. "Look here, this small kink in the H. You see how it bends back before joining the next letter? That's not Cobbled style. But it does belong to someone else from that same office, one Mr. Edwin Shankly. He was the firm's senior clerk and, according to an old personnel file, the one who typed Cobbled's letters when illness made writing difficult in his final months." Love whistled softly. "You think Shankly's behind all this?"
"After all these years?"
"Perhaps not behind," said Purbright, "but certainly within reach of it. He retired to the coast some years ago, but a place called Gullmarsh seems a suitable setting for reflection. I believe a visit would be instructive. Do you expect he'll tell you anything?"
"I expect he'll tell me something."
"Truth, however, may arrive only as a courtesy. By noon, Purbright had arranged for temporary leave from the station. He travelled light, one suitcase, a folded raincoat, and the diary page enclosed in a brown envelope. The train to Gulmarsh left from the small, soot-blackened platform at Flaxborough Junction, its arrival announced by a single, weary whistle. He took a window seat. The countryside drifted past. Flat fields, ditches gleaming under weak light, the occasional solitary tree bowing to wind. The rhythm of the train matched his thoughts, steady, restrained, with an undercurrent of inevitability. As miles passed, he considered what remorse might compel a man to do after so long: to forge a dead colleague's hand, to send letters that reopen wounds. It was not malice alone that drove such acts. More often, it was the peculiar vanity of guilt, the wish to be known as sorrowful. The sea appeared first as a suggestion, a smudge of darker grey on the horizon. Then, as the train slowed, the faint gleam of waves beyond the dunes. Gulmarsh itself was a small town faded by salt and nostalgia. Its streets were narrow, its air damp with seaweed and age. Purbright found the address easily enough. A cottage half sunk into the shingle, with lace curtains and a gate that complained at every movement. The sign on the doorbell read, E. Shankly. He knocked once, then again. After a pause, there came the slow sound of movement. Slippers on linoleum, the scrape of a latch. The man who appeared was stooped but tidy, his hair a disciplined white. He peered through thick spectacles, recognition dawning with a flicker of pride. "Inspector Purbright, isn't it?" Flaxborough Constabulary.
"I wondered when you'd come." Purbright inclined his head.
"You seem well informed, Mr. Shankly." The old clerk's smile was small, evasive. I read the Flaxborough Chronicle. One doesn't forget familiar names. Nor handwriting, I imagine. That drew a brief pause. Then Shankly stepped aside. "You'd better come in." The interior smelled faintly of dust and furniture polish, the scent of a life kept orderly, if not content. Papers were stacked with surgical neatness on the table beside a cold teapot. "I retired early," Shankly said, settling himself into an armchair. "Doctor's orders. The lungs." He gestured vaguely toward the sea. "Good air here," they said. "I've yet to notice the improvement." Purbright placed the envelope on the table. "This came recently into my hands, addressed to Mrs. Cobbold. It bears your manner of writing." Shankly's eyes lingered on it, then moved away. "I suppose I might have written something similar once. We all imitate ourselves when we grow old." "Not always so precisely," Purbright said gently. "You were close to Mr. Cobbold in his last years?" "As close as a subordinate could be."
"He wasn't an easy man. And yet you kept his secrets." "Secrets?"
The word came out thinly. "We all had them, Inspector."
"Even Mrs. Cobbold, especially she." Purbright regarded him a moment longer,
then said quietly, "Guilt ages poorly, Mr. Shankly. When it travels by post, it tends to arrive in fragments." The old man gave a soft laugh, dry, resigned. "Then perhaps I've sent my fragments too late." Purbright rose, sensing the interview had reached its edge. "You sent the key, didn't you? And the page. But why now?" Shankly's gaze drifted toward the window where the sea glimmered dully through the mist. "Because silence," he said, "isn't always peace. Sometimes it's just unfinished work." There was nothing more to say. Outside, the wind off the water carried the faint hiss of tide over shingle. Purbright stood for a moment, watching the gulls wheel above the harbour, each turn measured and soundless. He felt neither victory nor clarity, only that muted ache of understanding too late. The sea, like Flaxborough, had its own methods of concealment. It covered what it could not forgive. As he walked back toward the station, the first drops of rain began to fall, each one sharp and distinct against his coat. Behind him, somewhere in that cottage, a drawer closed softly, as if the past, at last, had been put away. The sound of the tide was closer now, steady and resigned, like an old metronome marking the last bars of a song. Purbright sat across from Edwin Shankly in the narrow parlour, the two men framed by the slow light of the sea through lace curtains. The tea had been poured but not drunk. Between them, on a low table, rested the brown envelope containing the forged letter and the faint smell of ink and gilt. Shankly's hands trembled slightly as he stirred his cup. "I suppose," he said at last, "it was bound to come to this. I'd half hoped you'd let sleeping memories be." "Sleeping memories?" Purbright repeated softly. "They tend to snore loudly in Flaxborough, Mr. Shankly. Someone always wakes to complain." The old clerk smiled faintly, a brief, regretful lift of the mouth. "You're right, of course. It was foolish. Sentimentality disguised as conscience. I found the key by chance, tucked in an old personnel file. I thought it was just an odd keepsake until I saw what else had been hidden with it." He paused, the spoon in his cup stilled. "There was a bundle of letters. Not between Cobbold and Miss Clee, those I knew about.
These were different.
They were from Mrs. Cobbold herself." Purbright's expression did not change, but his silence deepened. "She wrote to Miss Clee," Shankly went on, "after discovering the affair.
I didn't know until then how far it went."
The tone, it wasn't outrage, it was calculation. She gave the poor woman a choice, end things quietly or face public ruin. It wasn't money she asked for, not at first.
Only silence.
But silence has its price, Inspector, and she collected it more than once. Purbright leaned back slightly, his voice even. "And her husband?" "He never knew. Or if he did, he pretended not to. Men like him valued serenity more than truth." "Yet Miss Clee kept the desk," Purbright murmured.
"And the letters?" "Yes," said Shankly.
"That was her revenge, I think. Not in malice, but in insurance. She couldn't bear to destroy them. When she died, her nephew sold off her things. I helped catalogue them for probate, and there they were, wrapped in brown paper with the key tied on top. It was as if she'd left the means for someone to open the past again." "And you obliged?" He hesitated, a tremor of shame breaking through his composure. "Yes, I thought perhaps Mrs. Cobbold deserved to remember what she'd done. Not for vengeance, you understand, but for symmetry. The truth should find its way home." Purbright stirred his tea without tasting it. "So you forged her husband's hand, posted the key, and later the diary page. Why the performance, Mr. Shankly? Why not simply send the letters?" The old man's voice softened. "'Cause cruelty's easy. Remorse isn't. I didn't want to punish her, only to let her see herself again, as she was then."
"I thought the past might do it more gently than I could." He leaned forward, his gaze unsteady.
The diary page was real, you know. Cobbold wrote it, not in confession to God yet, and to himself. I found it in a file marked Private Personnel. He'd written that he'd stolen not money but honour, hers, Miss Clee's. That line stayed with me all these years, a theft of words and honour. He knew what he'd taken, even if he couldn't give it back. Purbright's eyes rested on him for a long moment. "You thought you were mending something?" "I hoped to." Shankly's breath caught on the edge of a sigh. "But I see now that memory doesn't heal."
"It only reopens neatly." Outside, the sea sighed against the shingle, a long inhalation that filled the pause between them. Purbright spoke again, his voice quiet but edged with thought.
"You returned the key to her? Symbolic, perhaps, but crueler than you intended. You must have known she'd see it as a message from the dead." "She needed to," Shankly said, his eyes shining with the effort of confession. "I wanted her to feel that the past still had a hand in things, that it wasn't gone, only misfiled." The inspector nodded slowly. "You've the tidy mind of a clerk, Mr. Shankly. Everything must balance." "Perhaps." He gave a thin smile. "I thought justice was an equation, but I forgot how emotion distorts the figures. You can't calculate grief." The kettle began to whistle faintly in the next room, but neither man moved to silence it. Purbright reached into his pocket and drew out the key, placing it gently on the table. It caught the sea light, a dull, resigned gleam. "This then was yours originally?" "Yes," said Shankly, almost whispering. It opened the side drawer of Cobbled's desk.
"I typed his letters, you see."
He trusted me with everything, except the one thing he ought to have confessed. After his death, Mrs. Cobbled ordered the desk sealed before it went to auction. Said it was a matter of respect. But I knew it was fear. "And so," Purbright said, "the key remained with you until now." "Until now," Shankly echoed. He stared at it a moment longer, then turned away, as though unable to bear its sight. "I wanted to end the story properly, Inspector. Everything else in life ends untidily." Purbright studied him, this weary relic of office years, this man who had carried other people's secrets longer than his own name. There was no triumph in him, only the dry fatigue of someone who had finally said what should never have been said aloud. He rose quietly. "I'll take the letters back to Flaxborough. They'll stay sealed unless there's need," Shankly nodded.
"You think she'll ever know the whole of it?"
Purbright paused by the doorway, looking out toward the mist that had thickened over the sea. People rarely face the full weight of their own pasts. They prefer to look through frosted glass. Clear enough to see the shapes, but not the details. The old clerk gave a small, sorrowful laugh. "Then perhaps I've only cleaned the window. Or opened it," Purbright said. "Time will tell which." He left Shankly sitting there, the sound of the sea filling the silence his confession had left behind. On the table, the key remained, a small, unremarkable object, glinting in the half-light, neither weapon nor relic, merely a reminder. Outside, the wind carried the taste of salt and distance. Purbright walked down toward the harbour, the sky bruised with dusk, the gulls lifting and falling like restless memories. He felt neither pity nor condemnation. Only the quiet recognition that human contrition once posted could never be recalled. Behind him, the kettle ceased its whine. In the little cottage by the sea, Edwin Shankly sat motionless, staring into the cold tea, while the waves continued their slow applause, the sound of a world that always, somehow, tidied itself in the end. The train back to Flaxborough rattled through the mist like a polite apology. Purbright sat alone in the carriage, the rhythmic hum of the wheels giving shape to his thoughts. The envelope containing Shankly's confession lay in his coat pocket, light as paper, heavy as consequence. Outside, fields blurred into a grey wash, hedgerows bowing under drizzle. He arrived just after dusk. The town was still, its windows glowing softly against the encroaching dark. Flaxborough after rain always smelled faintly of coal smoke and resignation. Purbright walked from the station to the police building without hurry, pausing once beneath a street lamp whose glow had caught the drifting mist in a halo of patient light. Love was waiting in the office, the evening paper folded beneath one arm and a pot of tea cooling beside him. "Welcome back, sir. Quiet day, unless you count the ferret incident in Market Street." "I'll resist the temptation to inquire," said Purbright, hanging up his coat. "I've had enough animal instinct for 1 week," Love smiled, then glanced at the envelope Purbright drew from his pocket.
"Any luck by the sea?" "If you can call confession luck," Purbright said mildly.
"Mr. Shankly has unburdened himself, though not with much joy." The key was his. So, it seems, was the conscience. Love looked intrigued. He admitted it? He did. Every polite act of remorse disguised as mystery. The letters, the key, the page, all sent in the hope of delivering justice at a distance against Mrs. Cobbled. Purbright poured himself a cup of tea, the sound of the liquid gentle and steady. Not against her, perhaps.
Toward her.
He thought she might find some moral symmetry in being reminded of her cruelty. She, after all, was the author of her husband's suffering, blackmailing his lover for the sake of appearances. It's an irony Shankly couldn't resist correcting. Love's face softened with something like pity.
And she knows this now?
She knows enough. Truth, like strong medicine, is best administered sparingly. He crossed to his desk, laying the envelope beside a neat pile of correspondence. There'll be no charges,
No headlines, no scandal.
What began as a ghost story ends as a study in etiquette. Love nodded, though uneasily. Do you think she'll recover? Recover? Purbright echoed, as though tasting the word. In Flaxborough, people don't recover love. They reclassify their pain, store it in a drawer with their family papers, and take it out only when it's safe to admire. The clock struck 7. Outside, a dog barked, and the sound seemed to dissolve into the air. She's withdrawn, Love said quietly. Mrs. Plum reports she's not left the house since your last visit. Curtains drawn.
No callers. Purbright's tone was gentle, almost kind.
Withdrawal can be an act of grace. She's learned something most people never do, that survival and dignity are not always the same thing. He leaned against the window frame, watching as fog coiled lazily through the lamplight outside. Closure, love, often arrives disguised as a riddle nobody wanted solved. It knocks once, leaves its envelope and departs before one can decide whether to open it. Love gave a rueful smile. That's very poetic, sir. It's also terribly inconvenient. They shared a brief silence, companionable in its melancholy. Then Purbright turned back to his desk, taking up the small brass key and holding it between forefinger and thumb. It gleamed faintly in the lamplight, stripped now of all menace. Strange thing, he said. How much importance we attach to objects. This, nothing but brass and memories, caused a small storm of speculation. And yet its purpose, when finally known, is no more than symbolic. The key didn't open anything. It closed something. He set it down gently beside the cup, where it caught the tremor of light from the window. I'll file it with the others. A tidy drawer of human puzzles. Each one began with a misunderstanding. Love glanced at the key, then at his superior. Do you ever get used to that, sir? The part where people ruin their own peace just to feel right again? Purbright smiled faintly. Used to it?
I rely on it.
Without that impulse, we'd have nothing to investigate. A moment passed. The faint ticking of the clock, the low hiss of the radiator, before he added more softly, though I sometimes wonder whether we solve anything at all, or merely arrive in time to record the moment a life tidies itself away. Love nodded, half in agreement, half in reflection. When Purbright left the station later, the streets had grown still enough that his footsteps seemed to carry for miles. The fog, thin now, drifted like a veil along the rooftops. Somewhere, a bell struck the hour. Distant, metallic, patient. He passed Bellway Terrace, where Mrs. Cobble's house stood in its careful darkness. Only one light burned within, a pale square behind lace curtains. A shadow moved briefly across it, then vanished. Purbright slowed, the faintest expression of compassion softening his features. Inside that light, he imagined her sitting among her quiet possessions. The photographs, the orderly mantle, the desk now reclaimed from memory. The key would be there too, perhaps on the table where he had first seen it, harmless at last. The story had resolved itself without triumph or tragedy, only completion. That, he thought, was the most civilized kind of ending Flaxborough ever allowed. As he turned toward home, a mist of rain began again, light and regular. The pavement gleamed, the lamps hummed faintly. Purbright drew up his collar and continued walking, unhurried, his figure dissolving gradually into the silver blur of evening. By the time he reached the corner of the square, the sound of his steps had faded entirely. Only the faint, constant rhythm of the rain remained, patient, deliberate, as though the town itself were restoring its usual politeness after a brief lapse into truth. The week that followed unfolded with the quiet efficiency of a household resetting itself after guests have gone. The rain eased, the river dropped back into its banks, and Flaxborough, never fond of sustained drama, resumed its steady, rhythmic decency. The church bells regained their composure, striking the hours with patient clarity, as though reminding everyone that time, not scandal, was the true keeper of order. Shopkeepers, having briefly speculated about ghosts and guilt, turned their attention to the approaching jumble sale. Mrs. Plum, feeling the moral dampness of recent events, had taken to speaking of Mrs. Cobbold only in sighs, her sympathy properly distant and dignified. The story of the mysterious key softened, first into curiosity, then into a cautionary anecdote, and finally into something polite enough to forget. From the window of his office, Inspector Purbright watched the market square return to its habitual choreography. Bicycles gliding, parcels exchanged, and gossip moving along the pavements with harmless momentum. He had, in a drawer, the letters, the confession, and the key, all labelled, sealed, and filed beneath domestic anomalies. It was a title he found oddly satisfying. Love entered quietly, carrying the morning's post and the faint smell of damp wool. "Another calm day, sir," he said. "No phantoms, no poison pen notes, no misplaced conscience." "Splendid," said Purbright, glancing at the clock. "A town deprived of mischief is like a kettle left off the boil, comfortingly dull but liable to grow stale." Love smiled. "You sound disappointed." "Not at all," Purbright said, turning back to the window. "I like to see the machinery run smoothly, even when one knows how much dust it hides beneath the cogs." He took the letters from the drawer, the papers faintly perfumed with the dust of closure. "The trouble with secrets, Love, is that they're never really buried, just archived." "Still," Love said, "Mrs. Cobbold seems to be keeping to herself."
"Curtains drawn, though Mrs. Plum swears she hears the wireless on most evenings." "Ah," Purbright murmured.
"Then she's begun to manage her solitude. That's the first sign of recovery. Do you believe she feels remorse, sir?" Purbright folded the papers back into their envelope with deliberate care. "Remorse, yes, but not for what she did, for being found out by time. It's rarely our actions that haunt us, Love, only the proof they leave behind." He replaced the envelope, shut the drawer, and rose, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders.
"Lock up, will you?"
"I'll take the long way home." The evening was gentle, almost apologetic. A low mist clung to the pavements, softening the lamps into small, forgiving halos. Purbright's footsteps sounded steady, each one a small punctuation in the sentence of the town's return to order. He passed the churchyard, where the grass shone dark under the thin rain. The stones there leaned in their customary silence, a congregation of names that had long since ceased to argue with history. Somewhere behind him a bell tolled 6, and the sound folded into the fog like a thought remembered too late. Along Bellway Terrace, the cottages glimmered faintly through the damp. At number 17, a single window glowed, warm, amber, constant. Purbright slowed his pace. Through the lace curtain he saw the faint silhouette of Mrs. Cobbold, seated in profile, unmoving but composed, a figure both diminished and dignified. Her hands appeared folded in her lap, the outline of her posture suggesting a woman listening not to the wireless, but to the quiet itself. He stood a moment longer, his breath visible in the cool air. There was nothing left to say or do. The story had concluded itself with more grace than any inquiry could have supplied. Still, he felt that peculiar ache of understanding, the kind that came not from solving mysteries, but from witnessing the aftermath of their solution. He turned away, pulling his collar close. The rain thickened, falling with the soft insistence of something cleaning without apology. Each drop struck the cobbles with the gentleness of an erased sentence. At the far end of the terrace, a gas lamp flickered, the flame bowing slightly to the wind. Beyond it lay the market square, the police station, and the modest collection of lives that would continue precisely as before, in their courteous rhythms of concealment and civility. Purbright walked slowly toward the glow, his coat darkening with moisture. His mind wandered, not to Mrs. Cobbold, nor to Shankly, but to the strange persistence of remorse itself. The dead, he thought, rarely asked forgiveness directly. They left the task to the living, who performed it badly but earnestly. He smiled faintly at the thought. "We're all custodians of unfinished apologies," he murmured to the night. A clock somewhere struck the half-hour. The sound moved through the mist, even and deliberate, like the heartbeat of the town. Purbright stopped at the corner and looked back once more. The cottage window still glowed, a small defiance against the greyness. Then quietly he went on. By the time he reached his house, the lamps had begun to blur under the growing rain. He let himself in without a sound, hung his coat, and paused in the hallway. From the sitting room came the faint crackle of his own wireless, a newsreader's voice delivering calm inevitabilities. He switched it off and stood, listening to the silence that followed. Outside, the rain continued, unhurried, unending, washing gently against the windows, polishing the cobbles, softening the outlines of the world. Flaxborough settled deeper into itself, content to forget, and in that soft, forgiving quiet, Inspector Purbright poured himself a final cup of tea, stirred it once, and sat by the window watching the mist reclaim the street. The reflections of the lamps trembled across the puddles like words unwritten. He lifted the cup, the steam rising to blur his features for a moment. A man framed not by triumph, but by understanding. Beyond the glass, the town slept behind its lace and lamplight, untroubled once more. The rain fell steadily, almost tenderly, carrying away what little trace remained of confession, deceit, and sorrow, and when at last the church bell struck the hour, its tones spreading outward across roofs and chimneys, it sounded not like warning nor lament, only continuation. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The end.